Servant girl collapsed on the castle steps. The Duke picked her up and never let her fall again. The snow was bitter that morning, the stone steps cold as iron. A poor servant girl fell to the ground, her strength gone, while nobles laughed at her shame. But then, boots echoed on the marble stairs. The most powerful man in the land bent down, lifted her into his arms, and carried her inside. It should have ended there. But whispers spread like wildfire. Rumors of scandal, a secret betrothal, and a dangerous plot to destroy her honor. A stolen necklace, a frame-up that could cast her from the castle forever. What will he risk to defend a woman the world says he cannot love? And what hidden truth will decide if she rises as a duchess or is cast out into the snow, never to return? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The bitter December wind howled through the market town as Clara trudged up the steep hill toward the Duke's castle. Her thin shoes offered little protection against the frozen ground, and her patched wool dress did little to ward off the biting cold. The heavy sack of flour seemed to grow heavier with each step, making her arms tremble from exhaustion. The night had been long, filled with extra duties in the vast castle kitchens. Clara's stomach growled painfully, reminding her of the bread she'd given to young Mary, the kitchen maid who lay sick with fever in the servants' quarters. But she didn't regret her choice. Helping others was what her father had taught her before he died, leaving her alone in the world. Just a few more steps, she whispered to herself, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The grand stone staircase loomed before her, its massive steps stretching upward like a giant stairway. 2 footmen stood at attention by the entrance, their fine livery marking them as the Duke's servants. Clara could feel their scornful gazes, following her as she began her ascent. Her vision swam, dark spots dancing before her eyes. The lack of food, the crushing exhaustion, and the bitter cold conspired against her. Clara tried to tighten her grip on the flour sack, but her fingers had gone numb. The world tilted sideways, and she felt herself falling. The last thing she heard was the thud of the flour sack hitting the stones and the mocking laughter of the footman. Then everything went black as she collapsed against the icy steps. Through the haze of unconsciousness, Clara dimly heard voices and felt a sudden warmth envelope her. Strong arms lifted her, cradling her against a broad chest that smelled of sandalwood and leather. The movement roused her slightly, enough to catch glimpses through half-closed eyes. "Your Grace," a scandalized voice exclaimed, "please allow us to handle this situation." "Stand aside," came the stern reply in a voice Clara knew well. Duke Edmund himself. But surely she was dreaming. The Duke would never... Yet it was no dream. Duke Edmund had been descending the steps, his dark cloak swirling in the morning wind, when he saw Clara fall. Without hesitation, he had swept her into his arms, shocking the entire household who had gathered to watch the scene unfold. "Prepare. My private chambers immediately," he commanded, his deep voice brooking no argument. "Send for Dr. Morris at once." Servants scattered in every direction, their whispers already spreading through the castle like wildfire. Never in living memory had a duke stooped to touch a common servant, let alone carry one in his own arms. The older staff members crossed themselves, certain this must be an omen of some kind. Clara was only vaguely aware of being carried through the castle's warm halls, up staircases she had only ever cleaned, but never traversed as a guest. The Duke's private chambers were known to be the finest in the castle, though few servants had ever glimpsed them. "Your Grace," the housekeeper protested as Edmund laid Clara gently on his own bed. "Surely the servants' quarters would be more appropriate." "Mrs. Winters," Edmund cut her off, his voice quiet but firm. "This young woman nearly froze to death on our doorstep. She will be tended to properly here, where I can be certain of her care." The Duke's large bed was softer than anything Clara had ever felt, the sheets finer than silk against her cold skin. As consciousness slipped away again, she felt a cool cloth being pressed to her forehead. Through her fever-induced haze, she heard the Duke dismiss everyone else from the room. Edmund sat in a chair beside the bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of Clara's chest as she breathed. His own heart felt strange, unsettled in a way he hadn't experienced since his wife's death 5 years ago. There was something about this girl, her quiet dignity, her kindness to others that he'd observed from afar, the way she carried herself with grace despite her lowly station. As Clara drifted in and out of fevered dreams, Edmund remained at her bedside, troubled by the unfamiliar stirrings in his heart. The morning sun crept higher in the sky, casting long shadows through the chamber windows, but still the Duke kept his vigil, unable to tear himself away from the sleeping girl who had somehow breached the carefully constructed walls around his heart. Candlelight flickered against the richly painted ceiling as Clara's eyes fluttered open. The softness beneath her felt foreign, so different from her thin straw pallet in the servants' quarters. Confusion clouded her mind as she took in the silk bed hangings and fine furnishings of what could only be a noble's chamber. "The patient wakes," announced a stern voice. Clara turned her head weakly to see Dr. Morris, the castle physician, standing beside the bed. His wire-rimmed spectacles caught the candlelight as he leaned forward to check her pulse. "Still feverish, but the bloodletting has helped draw out the illness." "As if a mere servant girl deserves such attention," muttered Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, who stood rigid and disapproving near the doorway. Her sharp features pinched with displeasure. "His Grace's commands or no, it sets a poor precedent." Clara's parched throat ached. I should return to my duties," she whispered, trying to rise despite her weakness. "You shall do no such thing," came a deep voice from the shadows. Duke Edmund stepped into the candlelight, his angular features softened by concern. "You will rest until fully recovered." Mrs. Graves cleared her throat. "Your Grace, the girl belongs below stairs. Already the household speaks of—" "Then let them speak," Edmund interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "She will remain here." Clara's fever-addled mind struggled to make sense of such kindness from the master of the castle. As the doctor pressed a cup of bitter medicine to her lips, she began to softly murmur the hymns her father had taught her in childhood. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." Edmund moved closer, drawn by her gentle voice. Clara's eyes were closed as she continued, reciting scripture between verses. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The Duke stood transfixed, something stirring in his chest at the pure faith in her words. It had been years since his wife's death, years of isolation behind the walls of duty and propriety. Yet this servant girl's simple devotion touched something, long dormant within him. Later that evening, Edmund sat at the head of the great dining table, surrounded by visiting nobles and gentry. The elegant room buzzed with whispered conversations and the clink of silver on fine china. Lord Pembroke, a corpulent man with a florid face, spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "Really, Edmund, showing such concern for a mere servant? Most irregular. One must maintain standards after all." Lady Ashworth tittered behind her fan. "Indeed! The girl should be dismissed for causing such disruption. Why, I heard she actually fainted on your very doorstep." Edmund set down his wine glass with deliberate care. The room fell silent as he rose to his feet, his presence commanding attention. "I find it curious," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "that those who pride themselves on noble birth should show so little nobility of spirit." A scandalized murmur rippled through the assembled guests. Edmund continued, his gaze sweeping the table. Mercy does not diminish dignity. Rather, it is the mark of true nobility. Lord Pembroke's face darkened with anger, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Duke's words hung in the air like a challenge to generations of rigid social custom. As the strained dinner concluded, Edmund made his way back to the chamber where Clara rested. The physician had departed, leaving only a drowsy maid to watch over the patient. In the soft candlelight, Clara's face appeared younger, more vulnerable. Her fever had broken at last, and she slept peacefully. Edmund settled into a chair beside the bed, studying her features, the gentle rise and fall of her. Breathing stirred something unexpected within him, feelings he had thought forever buried with his beloved wife, her simple faith, her kindness in giving away her own bread to help another. These spoke of a nobility that had nothing to do with birth or title. He watched as she slept, unsettled by the warmth growing in his heart. The candlelight cast dancing, shadows on the wall as Clara sighed softly in her healing slumber, while Edmund remained lost in thoughts he dared not yet name. A week had passed since Clara's collapse on the castle steps. The morning sun streamed through leaded glass windows as she carefully made her bed in the small servant's chamber where she had been moved to recover. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the rough blanket, but determination gleamed in her eyes. The kitchen's familiar warmth and bustle beckoned. Clara tied her apron strings and stepped through the doorway, only to find conversations dropping to whispers. Cook Margaret gave her a motherly smile, but others turned away, their faces clouded with suspicion. "There she is, the Duke's pet," one scullery maid muttered, just loud enough to hear. "Hush now," old Thomas the butler scolded. "The girl has more courage than the lot of you combined, working herself near to death for others." Clara kept her head down, focusing on kneading bread dough despite her still weak arms. The yeasty smell brought comfort as she worked, trying to ignore the mix of kind and cruel glances cast her way. "Did you see how he carried her himself?" She heard Martha, a chambermaid, whisper excitedly to her friend. "Like something from a fairy story." "More like witchcraft," came the harsh reply. "No proper duke would touch a common servant so." Clara's cheeks burned, but she continued her work steadily, offering silent prayers for strength. By midday, her arms ached fiercely, but she volunteered to carry fresh linens upstairs, wanting to prove herself useful again. As she climbed the grand staircase, voices drifted from the drawing room. Clara paused, recognizing the cultured tones of visiting nobility. "The arrangement is nearly settled," a woman's voice declared. "Lady Beatrice will make a perfect duchess, and the alliance with her family will secure the Duke's position at court." "Indeed," a man replied, "though I hear he's been distracted lately by some servant girl he took a fancy to. Quite the scandal." Cruel laughter followed. "Oh yes, his little peasant charity case. How convenient. We can use that to pressure him. After all, what better way to restore his reputation than a proper marriage to a lady of breeding?" Clara's hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the linens. She hurried past the door, her heart pounding. The Duke, to be married to Lady Beatrice, the beautiful noblewoman who swept through the castle in rustling silks, treating servants like furniture? In the quiet of the linen closet, Clara sank to her knees in prayer. "Lord, grant me wisdom," she whispered. "I never meant to cause trouble. I never meant—" Tears slid down her cheeks as guilt gnawed at her. Because of her weakness, because of that moment on the steps, the Duke's reputation was at risk. She was just a servant. She had no right to dream otherwise, no matter how gentle his eyes had been as he watched over her illness. That evening, as Clara served at the high table, she kept her gaze firmly fixed on her tasks. She could feel the Duke's presence, sense his occasional glance her way, but she didn't dare look up. The memory of his kindness during her fever burned like a brand, kindness that had led to whispers and schemes that might hurt him. Edmund frowned slightly as he noted Clara's downcast eyes and rigid posture. Where was the quiet strength he had glimpsed as she murmured prayers in her delirium? What had changed to make her shrink from him so? He watched her slip away into the shadows as soon as her duties were complete, troubled by the distance he could feel growing between them. But Clara carried her newfound knowledge like a weight in her heart, determined to step back, to be nothing more than a proper servant should be. It was the only way to protect him, even if each avoided glance felt like a small wound. She didn't see how Edmund's eyes followed her retreat, or how his hands clenched briefly before he turned back to his barely touched meal. Winter's icy grip tightened around the castle walls as December deepened into its darkest days. The chapel stood quiet in the pale morning light, dust motes dancing in the colored beams that filtered through the stained glass windows. Duke Edmund's footsteps echoed on the stone floor as he entered, drawn by the gentle swish of a broom against ancient flagstones. Clara worked steadily, her thin shoulders moving rhythmically as she swept. The simple grace of her movements caught Edmund's eye. Even in such a humble task, there was something that spoke of inner dignity. She wore the same patched dress she had collapsed in weeks ago, though now it was clean and carefully mended. "Leave us, Thomas," Edmund commanded the elderly sacristan, who bowed and shuffled away, shooting curious glances over his shoulder. Clara startled at the Duke's voice, dropping into a quick curtsy. "Your Grace, I beg pardon. I can return later if you wish to pray in private." "No, stay." Edmund's voice was softer than usual. He gestured to a wooden pew. "Sit with me a moment." Color rose in Clara's cheeks, but she carefully propped her broom against the wall and perched at the very edge of the bench, maintaining a proper distance. "Tell me," Edmund said, studying her profile in the morning light, "how came you to service here?" Clara's hands twisted in her apron. "My father, Your Grace. He was the schoolmaster in the village, a good man who taught me my letters and numbers, along with scripture." Her voice grew quiet. "But fever took him 2 winters past. There were debts. The new schoolmaster would not honor father's arrangements with families too poor to pay. I took service here to settle what was owed." "A heavy burden for one so young," Edmund observed. "'Tis no burden to help others, Your Grace." Clara's chin lifted slightly. "Father taught me that we must aid those weaker than ourselves, whatever the cost. I made a vow at his graveside to live by his example." Edmund was silent for a long moment, watching how the colored light painted her face in soft blues and golds. "Your father taught you well, it seems. Tell me, what do you make of this year's harvest tithe?" Clara's eyes widened at such a question, from a duke to a servant. But seeing his genuine interest, she spoke carefully. "The drought was hard on the tenant farmers, Your Grace. Many struggle to feed their children, let alone pay their full share." "Go on," Edmund encouraged, leaning forward slightly. Perhaps if the payment were delayed until spring, when they can sell at better prices." Her voice grew more confident as Edmund nodded. "And the elderly might pay in labor instead, mending walls or tending the kitchen gardens. Over the next hour," Edmund drew out her thoughts on various estate matters. Clara spoke with simple clarity about the villagers' needs, the timing of plantings, how to fairly settle disputes between neighbors. Her practical wisdom, uncluttered by political maneuvering, struck him as refreshingly pure. In the days that followed, servants whispered in amazement as the Duke regularly sought Clara's counsel. In the library, heads bent together over account. Books, she would explain which families needed help with winter fuel. In the courtyard, she would quietly identify which workers had skills being wasted in their current positions. Most shocking of all, the Duke listened. Where noble advisors offered flattery and elaborate schemes, Clara gave honest, straightforward answers. And increasingly, Edmund acted on her suggestions, earning cautious gratitude from the common folk. On this particular morning, as their discussion concluded, heavy snow had begun falling outside the chapel windows. Edmund rose and, to Clara's astonishment, offered his arm. "Allow me to escort you back. The steps will be treacherous in this weather." Clara hesitated, her heart pounding. To take a duke's arm. It was unthinkable for a servant. Yet the memory of those icy steps where she had collapsed made her shiver. Slowly, she placed her fingers on his sleeve, feeling the fine wool beneath them. They walked in silence through the empty corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. The warmth of his nearness both comforted and frightened her, making her all too aware of the impossible distance between their stations. Yet for these few precious moments, as the snow fell soft and white outside the windows, Clara allowed herself to simply walk beside him, treasuring what could never truly be hers. The castle bustled with preparation for the Yuletide feast. Carriages rattled over the frozen cobblestones, bringing nobles from across the countryside. Their fine horses stamped in the courtyard, breath-forming clouds in the crisp winter air. Inside, servants scurried through narrow corridors carrying platters, linens, and countless beeswax candles. In the sweltering kitchens below, Clara wiped perspiration from her brow as she helped prepare elaborate dishes. Her fingers worked swiftly, crimping pastries and garnishing roasted fowl. The air was thick with the scent of spiced wine, roasting meat, and fresh-baked bread. "Mind those candles, boy!" the cook bellowed at a young scullion who stumbled past with an armload of tapers. "One spark near the lard and we'll all go up in flames!" But the warning came too late. The boy tripped on his own feet, and a lit candle tumbled from his grasp. It rolled straight toward the open barrel of lard stored near the hearth. Time seemed to slow as Clara watched the flame catch the edge of the wooden container. Without hesitation, Clara lunged forward. She gathered her woolen skirts in both hands and pressed them against the growing flames, smothering them before they could spread to the rest of the stored fat. The heavy fabric singed her hands, but she held firm until the last ember died. "Saints preserve us." The cook crossed herself. "You've saved more than the feast, girl. You've saved lives. That fire would have taken half the castle." Clara's hands trembled as she examined her scorched skirts, but she managed a small smile. "God's mercy is great," she said softly. "I only did what anyone would do." Hours later, the great hall glowed with hundreds of candles. Ladies in silk and velvet twirled with gentlemen in embroidered coats as musicians played from the gallery. Clara stood quietly against the wall with other servants, watching the splendor while keeping goblets filled and dropped handkerchiefs retrieved. Her gaze couldn't help but follow Duke Edmund as he moved through the crowd. He looked magnificent, in deep blue velvet, his bearing regal as he greeted his guests. Yet she noticed how his smile never quite reached his eyes, how his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. The musicians began a stately pavan. Clara's heart nearly stopped as Edmund turned away from a countess's daughter and began walking directly toward her. Whispers rippled through the assembly as he crossed the invisible line that separated nobility from servants. He stopped before her and extended his hand. "Will you honor me with this dance?" Clara felt the shocked stares of everyone in the hall. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I don't know how to dance properly." "Then I shall teach you." His voice was gentle but firm. "You saved my home and my people today. Allow me to show my gratitude." With trembling fingers, Clara placed her hand in his. He led her to the center of the hall, and she was acutely aware of her plain dress among the silken jewels. But Edmund's calm dignity seemed to create a shield around them, and his quiet instructions helped her find the rhythm of the dance. "Step and turn," he murmured, guiding her through the figures. "Just so. You dance as gracefully as you show courage." Above them, servants gathered in the gallery began to clap in time with the music. The sound grew stronger, drowning out the disapproving murmurs of the nobility. Clara's heart soared as Edmund's hand held hers, warm and steady. For these precious moments, the rigid barriers of class and station seemed to melt away like frost in sunlight. When the dance ended, Clara curtsied deeply and slipped away to her duties, though her feet felt as though they floated rather than walked. She worked until the last guests departed, helping to clear away plates and snuff candles. Finally, in the quiet hours before dawn, she climbed the narrow stairs to her small chamber in the servants' wing. Sitting on her thin mattress, Clara pressed her hands to her cheeks, still warm with joy. Perhaps love truly could bridge any divide, even one as vast as that between a duke and a servant girl. For the first time since entering service, she allowed herself to dream of a future filled with more than just duty and sacrifice. The winter morning dawned harsh and bitter, 2 days after the grand Yuletide feast. Clara moved through her duties, with quiet grace, though her heart still danced with memories of that magical evening. The wooden floors creaked beneath her worn shoes as she carried fresh linens through the servant corridors, trying to ignore the whispers that followed in her wake. "Morning inspection!" The housekeeper's sharp voice cut through the air like a knife. Clara stood at attention with the other maids as Mrs. Weatherby swept through the servants' quarters, her keen eyes searching for any sign of disorder. The inspection proceeded as usual until they reached Clara's small chamber. Mrs. Weatherby's practiced hands lifted Clara's thin straw mattress, and there it was. Gasps filled the cramped space as lamplight caught the glitter of diamonds. Lady Beatrice's necklace! Mrs. Weatherby's face turned white with shock. She held up the sparkling treasure, its perfectly cut stones catching the morning light. "In a servant's bed." Clara's heart stopped. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, I would never." But servants and house staff were already backing away from her, faces twisted with betrayal. Word spread through the castle like wildfire, and within the hour, Clara stood trembling before an assembly of nobles in the great hall. Lady Beatrice's elegant figure radiated cold fury from where she stood beside the other courtiers. "I always knew she was a snake," Lady Beatrice declared, her voice dripping with venom. "Bewitching his grace with false modesty while plotting theft all along." Tears rolled down Clara's cheeks as she faced her accusers. "Please, your grace," she pleaded, meeting Edmund's troubled gaze. "I have never stolen anything. I would rather starve than take what isn't mine." Edmund stepped forward, his face stern with conviction. "I know this woman's character," he declared. "She speaks truth. This is clearly a plot to discredit her." The nobles erupted in outrage. "You would take a servant's word over that of Lady Beatrice?" Lord Ashworth demanded. "This goes beyond mere impropriety, your grace." The crown's emissary, Lord Blackwood, moved to Edmund's side. His voice was soft, but carried deadly warning. "Your grace, consider carefully. The crown takes a dim view of nobles who forget their station. Your estate's charter depends upon royal favor. Surely you would not risk everything for a mere serving girl." Clara watched the conflict play across Edmund's features. His jaw tightened as he glanced between her and the assembled nobility. In that moment, she saw the impossible weight crushing him, duty to his estate and thousands who depended upon him, versus his heart's conviction of her innocence. She couldn't bear it. She wouldn't be the cause of his ruin. "Your grace," she said softly, dropping into a deep curtsy. "I beg your forgiveness for any trouble I have caused. I will remove myself from your household immediately." Edmund's eyes met hers, filled with anguish he dared not voice. "Clara!" But she had already turned away, hurrying from the great hall as Lady Beatrice's triumphant smile followed her retreat. That evening, Clara moved like a ghost through her tiny chamber. She packed her few belongings, her father's worn Bible, a spare dress, the warm shawl Edmund had insisted she accept during her illness. Each item carried memories that now cut like knives. The castle had grown quiet, most residents already abed. Only the night watch moved through the corridors, their footsteps echoing distantly. Clara waited until the midnight bell tolled before, slipping from her chamber one final time. The servant's gate creaked softly as she pushed it open. Fresh snow was falling, the flakes catching the light of her single candle before disappearing into darkness. Clara paused at the threshold, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "Lord," she whispered, her prayer barely audible above the winter wind, "protect him. Grant him wisdom and peace. And—" her voice caught on a sob. "Help me be strong enough to walk away." With those words, Clara stepped through the gate. The snow swallowed her footprints as she disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the echo of her whispered prayer and the ghost of a love that dared to reach across society's bounds. The next morning, frost etched delicate patterns across the castle windows as Edmund strode through the servants' quarters, his heart growing heavier with each empty room. Clara's small chamber lay bare, the thin blanket folded neatly, her few belongings gone. Only a worn prayer book remained on the wooden shelf, forgotten in her haste. "Your Grace," the elderly cook approached, wringing her apron. "She left in the night. None saw her go, but—" she gestured to Clara's abandoned shawl hanging by the kitchen door. Edmund's face darkened like storm clouds. Without a word, he swept from the room, his boots echoing against stone floors as he descended to the courtyard. "Ready my carriage," he commanded. "Now!" The stableman scrambled to obey as Edmund paced, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He knew the bitter cold could kill a lone traveler, especially one as weakened as Clara had been. The thought squeezed his chest like an iron band. Soon the carriage wheels crunched through fresh snow as Edmund directed his driver from village to village. They stopped at every inn, every church, every humble dwelling that might offer shelter to a girl alone. The winter wind howled around them, but Edmund refused to turn back as darkness fell. "Your Grace, the horses need rest," his driver pleaded as they approached yet another hamlet. "The roads are treacherous with ice." "Then we'll stable them and continue on foot," Edmund replied, his voice brooking no argument. He had never felt so helpless, so driven by desperate need. Meanwhile, Clara had found refuge in a small stone chapel on the outskirts of a poor farming village. The elderly vicar had discovered her shivering in the church porch at dawn and offered her shelter, without question. Now she sat surrounded by village children, teaching them their letters just as her father had once taught her. "That's wonderful, Thomas," she encouraged a small boy who had carefully scratched out his name. The children's eager faces warmed. Her heart, though it still ached with memories of the castle and Edmund. The villagers quickly came to cherish Clara's gentle presence. She helped the vicar's wife tend to those sick with winter fever, read to the elderly who could not see well enough to read themselves, and never turned away anyone in need. Her own pain eased somewhat as she threw herself into caring for others. "You have the bearing of a lady," the vicar's wife remarked one evening as Clara helped her prepare soup for the sick. "Yet you work as hard as any peasant girl." Clara smiled sadly. "True nobility lies in the heart, not in titles," she replied, though her voice caught on the words. Back at the castle, Edmund's fury blazed hot enough to melt snow when a trembling stable hand confessed the truth about the diamond necklace. Lady Beatrice's cousin had offered him a purse of gold to hide it in Clara's room. hoping the scandal would force Edmund into the arranged marriage. "She was innocent," Edmund's voice thundered through the great hall. "Innocent, while you all condemned her." The gathered nobles shrank back from his rage. He ordered his fastest horses hitched to a light sleigh. A passing tinker had mentioned seeing a girl matching Clara's description in a village to the north, teaching children in the chapel there. Edmund's heart leaped at this first real hope. The sleigh runners hissed over packed snow as Edmund urged. The horses faster. He had been a fool to let others' prejudices come between them. Clara's true nobility shone brighter than any jewels, her wisdom worth more than all his lands. He would not lose her again. "Faster," he urged the horses, leaning forward against the bitter wind. Ahead, through swirling snow, church bells tolled the evening hour. Edmund prayed they would lead him to Clara, and that she would find it in her heart to forgive him. The village lights began to glimmer through the gathering dusk. Edmund's grip tightened on the reins as he guided the horses toward the small stone chapel, its windows glowing with welcoming warmth. He had found her at last. The winter sunlight filtered through the chapel's cracked windows, casting pale beams across worn wooden pews. Clara stood before a gathering of village children, her gentle voice leading them in a familiar hymn. Though the chapel was drafty and humble, with its stone walls barely holding back the morning chill, the children's voices rose pure and clear. "All creatures of our God and King," they sang, their breaths visible in the cold air. Clara smiled warmly at each young face, her own troubles momentarily forgotten as she guided their simple worship. Her patched dress and thin shawl offered little protection from the cold, but her heart was warmed by the children's earnest participation. The vicar's wife had lent Clara a faded blue ribbon to tie back her hair, and despite her circumstances, she carried herself with quiet dignity. The past week in the village had brought her a different kind of peace. Here, among the poor but honest folk, she found acceptance without judgment. "Lift up your voices, let us sing," Clara encouraged softly, gesturing for the smaller children to join in. A little girl with red mittens grinned toothlessly up at her, singing with particular enthusiasm. The chapel door creaked open, letting in a swirl of snowflakes. Clara's voice faltered as a tall figure entered, his fine cloak dusted with frost. The children's singing faded to whispers, then silence as Duke Edmund stepped into their midst. The villagers present, mostly mothers and grandmothers, drew back in astonishment as the Duke moved down the narrow aisle. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped her hymnal tighter, her face growing pale. But Edmund did something extraordinary. There, before the humble congregation, he lowered himself to his knees on the rough stone floor. His proud bearing gave way to humility as he looked up at Clara with eyes full of remorse. "I have failed you," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed chapel. "I should have protected you from their schemes and malice. I have proof now of your innocence. The stable hand has confessed to planting the necklace on Lady Beatrice's orders." Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. The villagers murmured in surprise, several making the sign of the cross at this unprecedented scene, a duke kneeling before a servant girl. "Your Grace," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Please rise. You shouldn't kneel before someone like me." "I kneel before goodness and truth," Edmund replied firmly. "You showed me what true nobility means, not through birth, but through character. I beg your forgiveness for not standing stronger against the injustice done to you." Clara's tears fell freely now. The little girl with red mittens reached up and took her hand in comfort. "But your Grace," Clara managed, "returning with you would only bring more scandal. I cannot bear to cause you further trouble with the court." Edmund rose then, closing the distance between them with 2 steps. "Let them gossip," he said with quiet intensity. I carry signed confessions that will clear your name, but more than that, I carry a heart that has learned to love again through your gentle wisdom. Will you return with me to face the court? Not as a servant, but as my equal?" The chapel held its collective breath. Clara looked around at the kind faces of the villagers who had sheltered her, at the children who had brought her joy even in exile. Then she looked back at Edmund, seeing in his eyes the same steadfast faith she had always tried to show others. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. "With God's help," she whispered, "I will." The vicar, who had been watching silently from the doorway, stepped forward to offer a prayer of blessing. As he spoke words of protection and guidance, Clara felt a deep peace settle over her heart. When the prayer ended, Edmund offered Clara his arm. She took it with trembling fingers, and together they walked down the chapel aisle. The villagers pressed forward to wish them well, the children waving goodbye to their beloved teacher. Outside, Edmund's carriage waited, its horses stamping in the snow. As he helped Clara inside, the village folk gathered in the chapel doorway, their faces bright with hope at this living testament that love truly could bridge any divide. The castle loomed against the winter sky as Edmund's carriage approached the main gates. Clara's hands trembled in her lap, her heart pounding beneath her simple wool dress. Through the frosted window, she could see a dozen fine carriages already lined up in the courtyard, their noble occupants, no doubt, gathered inside. "Have faith," Edmund said softly, reaching across to steady her trembling fingers. "Truth will prevail today." The carriage door opened to a blast of icy air and a chorus of shocked whispers. Nobles lined the grand entrance hall, their silk gowns rustling as they drew back from Clara as if she carried plague. Lady Beatrice stood at the top of the marble staircase, her face a mask of practiced disdain. "Your Grace," she called down, her voice dripping with false concern, "have you truly brought this person back to trouble us further?" Edmund's jaw tightened as he guided Clara forward, his hand protective at her elbow. "I have brought justice back to these halls, my lady, something sadly lacking these past weeks." The assembled crowd followed them into the great hall, where the crown's emissary sat in state before the roaring hearth. Clara felt the weight of hundreds of judgmental eyes upon her, but she held her head high, remembering the simple dignity she had learned in the village chapel. "My lords and ladies," Edmund's voice rang out clear and strong, "you were quick to condemn this woman on false evidence. Now you shall hear the truth." He gestured, and a nervous stable hand was brought forward, twisting his cap in rough hands. "Speak," Edmund commanded gently. "Tell them what you told me." The stable hand's voice shook, but grew stronger as he spoke. "It were Lord Philip, my lady's cousin, who paid me 10 guineas to hide that necklace. Said it would help secure a better match for the family. He did. I am ashamed of my part in it." A scandalized murmur swept through the hall. Lord Philip, standing near Lady Beatrice, turned pale as Edmund produced a leather pouch. "The very coins," Edmund declared, "marked with the Royal Mint's special stamp from last autumn, coins traced directly to Lord Philip's personal accounts." Lady Beatrice's carefully maintained composure cracked. "Cousin, you fool," she hissed. "You promised. None could prove." She caught herself, but too late. The crown's emissary leaned forward, his stern face thoughtful. "It seems we have uncovered more than simple theft. Conspiracy against a duke's household is a grave matter." Lord Philip fell to his knees, babbling excuses, while Lady Beatrice's face turned to stone. Clara felt no triumph at their disgrace, only sadness at the darkness in human hearts. Edmund turned to face the assembly, his voice ringing with authority. "If nobility lies in virtue, then this woman is nobler than all assembled. She bore false accusation with grace, helped the poor without reward, and showed more dignity in hardship than those born to privilege." A ripple of gasps met his words, but Clara saw something shifting in the faces around her. Some of the younger nobles nodded thoughtfully, while several older ladies dabbed at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs. The crown's emissary rose, his expression softened by what he had witnessed. "Your Grace," he declared, "you have proven both the innocence of this woman and the wisdom of your judgment. Therefore I rule that you may marry whom you please, provided you continue to govern these lands with such justice." The hall erupted in exclamations of surprise. Edmund turned to Clara, taking her work-roughened hand in his before all assembled. "My heart chose wisely," he said softly, though his words carried to every corner. "Will you consent to be my Duchess and help me bring compassion to this place?" Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Edmund drew her close, declaring in a ringing voice, "Let it be known. This woman will be my wife." As if heaven itself approved, the castle chapel bells began to toll, announcing the banns of marriage. The sound rolled over the assembled nobles, some still shocked, others beginning to smile. A new chapter was beginning, not just for Clara and Edmund, but for all who witnessed love's triumph over pride that winter's day. The castle chapel blazed with hundreds of beeswax candles on that crisp winter morning. Garlands of evergreen and white ribbon adorned every pew, their fresh scent mingling with incense. Through the stained glass windows, sunlight cast rainbow patterns across the stone floor where Clara stood beside Edmund, her heart full to bursting. Villagers filled the back rows, their rough woolens a stark contrast to the silk and velvet of the nobles seated near the front. In between sat the castle servants, who beamed at Clara with genuine joy. The divisions of rank seemed to blur in the holy space, united by witness to true love's triumph. Clara wore a gown of cream silk, simple yet elegant, with tiny pearls sewn along the bodice. A crown of white roses rested upon her dark hair. Edmund, resplendent in his finest coat, could not take his eyes from her face as they spoke their vows before God and witnesses. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, duke and duchess, the chapel erupted in cheers that shook the very rafters. Even some of the once disapproving nobles dabbed at their eyes, moved by the genuine love that shone between the couple. Later that day, as the wedding feast began, Clara rose from her place at the high table. The hall fell silent as she made her first proclamation as Duchess. "From this day forward," she declared in a clear voice that carried to every corner, "the castle kitchens shall feed any hungry child or servant who comes to our door. Never again shall anyone on these lands suffer the pangs of hunger as I once did." The servants burst into applause, while several nobles whispered behind their hands. But Edmund's face glowed with pride as he stood beside his bride, supporting her first act of compassion as Duchess. As night fell and the celebrations wound down, Edmund led Clara to their private chamber. A cheerful fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm shadows on the tapestried walls. Sitting beside her on a cushioned settle, he took her hand in his. "My love," he whispered, his voice tender with emotion, "from the moment you fell upon my castle steps, I made a silent vow that you would never fall again." He kissed her fingers gently. "Now you stand beside me, stronger than any duchess born to the title." Clara's eyes shone with happy tears as she leaned against his shoulder, their hands entwined in perfect peace. The firelight danced around them, blessing their union with its gentle warmth. If something today spoke to the part of you that still believes in love, stay a while. Subscribe. I'll be here again tomorrow with another story worth feeling.